Welcome to the Commercial Awareness Compass. This is your weekly guide to developing commercial insight in a way that goes beyond just the news. Each week, we focus on one major story, breaking it down to help you build your understanding at 3 levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. I'm Tori, I'm a future trainee solicitor, and I'm joined by Henry, a corporate lawyer and content creator. Today's session, we are going to focus on the Financial Conduct Authority's plans to regulate buy now, pay later schemes. So as we go through the beginner, intermediate, and advanced levels, really pay attention to how each explanation builds on the last. So we'll start out with going over the basics, helping you get up to speed with what's going on here. Then we'll think about how businesses and industries are impacted and how law firms assist. And then finally, we'll think about strategic thinking and really looking at the big picture and thinking long term. So if we jump into the beginner section, Henry, could you please just start by giving us a quick overview of what is the story that we're talking about?
Yeah, for sure. So as you kindly mentioned briefly, we are talking about the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority's announcement that they've published their plans to regulate the UK's buy now, pay later industry, which I believe is worth in the region of £13 billion. And in doing so, they propose introducing sort of mandatory affordability checks, even on transactions below £50. And they've done that because a lot of these platforms, like Klarna, for example, can be used to buy takeaways through Deliveroo or kind of other small purchases. And this is done to kind of curb loan stacking and also providing access to the financial ombudsman, which is what you individuals, consumers can do to make complaints about regulated credit providers, and also will ensure that individuals have support if their kind of borrowing is spiraling. Because I think when a lot of these credit agencies, lenders, Klarna and various other variations first came into play, there were concerns that this is going to lead to particularly younger people getting themselves into sort of debt loop cycles.
Thank you for that overview. And then we can just go over some of the basics to make sure that everyone has the same level of understanding about what we're discussing. So I think a lot of our listeners probably are familiar with these schemes, but for anyone who's not, could you please just give a quick explanation of what a buy now, pay later scheme is, how that actually works?
Yeah, for sure. So effectively, buy now, pay later is essentially what it does on the tin. I can sell something to you, Tori, you can buy it from me, but you don't pay let's just say you bought a coffee machine, it's £500. You buy it, you get it today, you pay for that over 3 months. And 3 months is generally the term that Klarna and all of these other variations use. And a lot of these, or all of these whole host of lenders use, and a lot of the installments, those 3-month installments, if you pay it back within that 3-month period, is often interest free. So that means you pay the £500, you don't pay £500 plus whatever the interest is. So this has become really, really popular with young people, especially shopping through online retailers, because it gives you the chance to have, I don't know, let's say you need an iPad for some work or something, gives you the opportunity to have the iPad today, but you don't necessarily have to pay for it today. So you can kind of factor that in when you're budgeting.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. And then I was also wondering why, I think the overarching question of kind of why we're talking about this now, why is regulation needed? What is the level of regulation of these schemes at the moment?
For the most part, a lot of these schemes, I keep talking about Klarna, but it's the most popular one. A lot of these are unregulated credit. So they don't necessarily fall within, they don't fall within the FCA's regulatory remit. So they don't have to abide to the same sort of standards and offer the same level of sort of affordability checks, creditworthiness checks that say you would have to do if you were, I don't know, applying for American Express or some other kind of credit card or bank loan. So what that means is that the popularity of buy now, pay later schemes has kind of increased rapidly, but hasn't had the same sort of oversight and regulatory oversight as credit cards, which has kind of raised concerns around people getting themselves into debt, people taking on more credit than they should, sort of living month to month on, particularly if you're at the junior end of the career, your salaries are are obviously lower because you have less experience in all of that good stuff, but then you're using credit to basically fund your life, which then results in sort of consumer harm and unaffordability. And one of the FCA's principles and part of their remit is to make sure that consumers are protected for the most part.
Thank you. That's also a really helpful segue into my next question, which was that. So we've mentioned the FCA a few times now. So could you just explain for anyone who's not familiar what the FCA is, what they do?
Yeah, for sure. So as we mentioned, the FCA is the Financial Conduct Authority, and that is the UK's financial regulator. And as we just mentioned, one of their key principles is to protect consumers from harm, to ensure that they're protected, and ultimately to ensure that the financial markets kind of work in the way that they're supposed to.
Thank you. I'm just having some SQE flashbacks because I remember that we did have to learn a little bit about what the FCA does as well. So my final question at this beginner stage, to make sure that everyone is up to speed, you did mention this a little bit at the beginning, but could you just provide a little bit of an overview about what this proposed regulation or new regulation would do?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the key things that it's the FCA are looking to do is introduce affordability checks, because at the moment I can go onto a website or a store. I think the thing is now you can also go into a store. You can go into the Apple store, for example, and pay there and then with Klarna. So you can walk into the store, buy something that you necessarily don't have the cash in your bank for right now, and pay for that using Klarna. So what this proposal is going to do is introduce affordability checks. Like any other bit of credit that you're trying to access, you generally have to be credit checked to check the credit worthiness, to check that your sort of debt to salary ratio means that you can pay for this. It's also going to introduce access to the financial ombudsman. So that's a body that you can raise grievances, you can raise complaints to if a credit provider isn't acting in a way that's in accordance with the FCA's kind of rules and regulations and their regulatory remit. And it's also going to require these buy now, pay later schemes to provide support and help and signpost them to resources if you are a borrower that's kind of struggling to pay back your loans, or if your kind of loan and your debt situation is escalating. Because we have to keep in mind that, again, a lot of these people that use these buy now, pay later schemes are young people. And we have this sort of risk then to the public that they are kind of getting themselves into unaffordable debts, which then impacts not only sort of their later sort of career progression. Say, for example, you want to become a solicitor, you cannot practice as a solicitor if you have been declared bankrupt, if you have a CCJ against your name. So if you're 21 at uni, whatever, and you're racking up debts through Klarna and otherwise that aren't paid back, and they're affecting your credit score, and ultimately you have to go to the courts and get a CCJ, a county court judgment, to wipe all the debts that you have. You then can't go on into the career that you want to because you've had this. So I think this is a real positive move from the FCA.
Thanks so much for that overview. And I think also connecting it to our audience, because I think for a lot of aspiring lawyers, we're so focused on what's the kind of education that we need to get, what are the exams that we need to write, that I think something that a lot of people are not familiar with is those kind of extra requirements that you would need to satisfy. So that connects really nicely to the story that we're talking about today. So now that we're all on the same page, we know the story that we're talking about. Let's move into the intermediate section. So at the intermediate level, this is where we're thinking commercially here. We're thinking about the perspectives of businesses and of law firms. So I thought it would be helpful to start out if you could just give an overview of what's the kind of advice, what's the kind of areas in which lawyers would be advising clients in relation to this kind of regulation.
Yeah, one of the biggest. Sorry, you've taken me back to my LPC days now, thinking about sort of the general prohibition and all of that stuff with the FCA. Is that a lot of these organizations that will now be coming into the FCA's regulatory remit is that they will need to be authorized by the FCA to be able to lend to consumers. So what lawyers in the financial services teams will need to be able to do and will be having to do in the future is guiding and advising clients like Klarna, like Very. Actually, I think Very is regulated, but we can double check that. That's some homework for everybody listening. Is that they will need to apply to the FCA to be regulated and to get authorized to be able to lend to consumers. And that will be satisfying certain threshold conditions, certain tests, governance regimes, and also financial crime controls. And that is something that the financial teams will be doing. If you're a trainee in a financial services team, you may be asked to check on the FCA's register to see what regulated activities certain organizations are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do, and how we get approval to do X, Y, and Z if that's what our clients are instructing us to do. We'll also need to be sort of discussing around sort of consumer duty and compliance. Again, one of the key roles of the FCA is to ensure that consumers are protected. So what we need to be doing is if we're advising Klarna, for example, we need to make sure that the customer journey to getting that money to lend and how we're going to pay that back, X, Y, and Z, all aligns with what the FCA require lenders to do in terms of their kind of consumer duties and the consumer journey, which again is going to be a huge thing to do. On top of that, we also have probably more from like I don't necessarily know what team this would sit in, but it's more on kind of the marketing side of things and the ad side of things, and making sure that any ads that are going out are compliant with the advertising standards regime as well, the ASA. Making sure that what we're saying is if you buy now, pay later, this is 0% interest, X, Y, and Z, that complies with all of the SCA's duties, required duties that the lenders have to provide to make sure nothing is misleading, to make sure that what's being put out is not unfair. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was just thinking about all of that because it sounds like there's quite a few different legal teams in a firm that would have to be involved, which I always feel is really helpful to outline to our audience, because then I think our audience is getting a grasp of how a law firm really operates and all the various departments that could be involved. Did you have anything more to say on the law firm side, or should we move to think about the business side here?
Yeah, and again, to speak off the back of what you just mentioned, Tori, in terms of the different teams, when I don't know to what extent our listeners have either bought property, signed up, got mortgages, got credit cards, or any other kind of financial products. But a lot of the time you need to have a credit reference agency, do the background checks to see your credit report and all of that. So the data teams will need to be involved as well, because if Klarna is going to be doing background checks on people and collating all of this personal information, we need to make sure that the consumer data is processed fairly and again in compliance with sort of data protection legislation, and also where things go wrong and we need to raise a dispute or there is an issue, what the process is kind of around that as well. So that would involve kind of the litigation team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I always think data privacy things are really interesting to reflect upon because there's so many issues related to that, and that it's of such consequence to your everyday person, but also to businesses. So I think it is really worth considering how that is relevant here. And then on the businesses side of things, so if we think of some of these buy now, pay later providers, what are the kind of commercial considerations and things that they're thinking about?
Yeah, so if we take it, so we are Klarna. The things that they'll need to be thinking about is we need to make sure that we are complying with the FCA's regulations. And obviously, if we fall foul of that, there is going to be penalties. We could be penalized. We could be sanctioned, and we could have our authorization removed. If our authorization is removed, we can no longer loan money to people, and that's the very premise of our business. So we need to be making sure that we're doing that. I think also if an organization is now regulated, I know a lot of these buy now, pay later agencies struggle to recoup a lot of their money, and a lot of them are operating at a loss. So they'll be considering how this affects recouping money that's kind of owed to them under their payment schemes. What are the costs involved? Are they going to kind of rethink their business models in line with sort of the change in the regulation? But then I think also it would be interesting to consider from the perspective of the actual retailer and how that impact, or how the regulation will impact, or the regulation of Klarna and other sort of lenders will impact consumer shopping habits. Because if you've got a load of young people, for example, using Klarna to shop on ASOS, if getting access to credit through Klarna is going to become more difficult for young people because they need to have a good credit worthiness, they need to have a good credit score. Perhaps they haven't really used credit before, so their credit rating may not be the best. Then maybe we'll see a difference in shopping purchasing powers as well, if there's less spending on certain retailers that are sort of more popular with young people. So again, that's going to be a really interesting space. And a lot of firms have a retail sector. So seeing how this kind of impacts that and the conversations that are coming out of those specific sectors within your firms will be really interesting to hear in sort of time when this kind of comes into effect.
Thank you. That's a really, really useful insight, actually, because I hadn't even thought about the retail sector yet, and the fact that if consumers do start to behave differently, then that is something that would affect the retailers. So it's this kind of indirect consequence of the regulation. So I think that is really interesting to highlight, because I think it shows how when you take a few minutes to really think about a commercial story, and then you try to think about it from all the various perspectives, there's so many links and so many different implications to think about. I also think that is a really great note for us to move on to advanced, because I think that is showing a little bit more of that long-term big picture thinking as well, of we're not just talking about a law firm here and the provider, we're also talking about consumers and retailers. So I think actually that is a perfect way to move into the advanced, unless I've moved us too quickly and there was anything else you wanted to say on intermediate.
No, absolutely not. I was just going to add that you're completely right on the considering a story from all different perspectives. And when you're kind of coming into your assessment days, Tori, this is probably a distant memory for you now, the assessment centers and the scenarios that you're given, you will be given a specific client within that scenario. So it's really important to make sure you're identifying who your client is and considering it from their perspective, because it's so easy to kind of think about how you want to answer it from the kind of idea that you've got in your head. But if you've said X, Y, and Z, but then you actually realize you're acting for the seller, not the buyer, all of the points that you've just made are kind of redundant, because they're not advising the client that you've been instructed to kind of advise. You're doing what you think you should be doing. So just to make sure that you're really clear on who the parties are and sort of tailor your advice to the instructions accordingly.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really, really helpful tip, because I think that that can make a huge difference in how you perform. Because yeah, you might think of such a great thing to say, but it's only relevant to the other side. So definitely you want to make sure you're focused on the client that you're representing. So in the advanced level, we are thinking long-term and strategically. So what really are some of the kind of long-term strategic considerations with a regulation like this?
I think that with the introduction of the FCA coming out with this and saying that they're going to kind of take the buy now, pay later market within their sort of regulatory remit, I think there is going to be a big shift in consumer credit and consumer credit reform. So over time, this isn't going to be an immediate change. This is going to be sort of over the next few months, next few years, into sort of 2026. But lawyers that sit within these financial services departments, the retail sector, consumer credit teams, they will really be looking out for any regulatory changes, any sort of reforms that are coming up, to make sure that the clients that they act for are kind of future-proofed and they're ready, and they're already thinking about, okay, we act for Klarna, we already need to start thinking about how do we get them FCA authorization, because there's no point in waiting until the day that this comes in and be like, oh, okay, cool, this has happened. Now we need to get them authorized, because authorization isn't something that happens instantaneously. You need to make sure that your client is meeting the relevant checks and providing all the relevant documentation, because if they can't suddenly do what their business is supposed to do on one day, because everything's been left to the last minute, then that business isn't going to be able to operate. It will then be at a loss because it's not providing money to consumers. Consumers then can't buy things, which again has that knock-on effect. So it's kind of that foreplanning and saying, this is coming up, we need to start thinking about this. And again, that's what makes a lawyer more than somebody who just says, this is what the law is. This is when you kind of step into the trusted advisor. This is where you add value. This is where you can kind of showcase that we're adding more for this client. And that's when the clients really get the real value from you as a lawyer.
And so if that is something that lawyers really need to do in order to provide that high level of service to their clients, what would you recommend? What kind of tips would you say for an aspiring lawyer to develop that skill, to keep on top of these developments?
I think, first and foremost, attending sort of sessions like this, which kind of highlights key stories to focus on, and then just follow on the stories. If there's a specific sector that you're interested in, if it's financial services, this is a really interesting story. This is a huge thing that the FCA is taking action to bring buy now, pay later into its regulatory remit. So follow it through. Again, as we just mentioned, it's not going to be something that we talk about today and it's done tomorrow. This is going to be going on for months into early next year. So you can kind of see where there's commentary around it. You can see sort of the different opinion pieces. You can say where people have contributed in papers, discussion pieces, where they have been asked for feedback. What is that feedback? How is this going to impact? And really kind of get yourself involved in this. So then let's just say you have an interview then in January. You can say you've got a really embedded and detailed knowledge of this story. So when you go into the firm that you really like, that's a really strong financial services team, you can say and talk about this story in such confidence because you know it so in detail. It's not just a surface level story you happen to read in the FT on the way to the law firm. You could be asked anything on it, obviously within reason, and you will be able to kind of answer that with confidence, and you're not worried about having them waiting for them to ask you a specific question because you've got such a deep understanding. And even if a question isn't quite what you thought it was going to be, you can really utilize what you've been following and how you've kind of understood the scenarios to then use this to your advantage and kind of weave it in a way that fits the question they've asked you.
Thank you so much. I know our listeners always love those extra tidbits. And I think that what you've said is a really good illustration of how developing your commercial awareness, so much of it is just about not passively reading the news. It's just like really thinking about it. And like you said, following along and giving yourself that time to really understand what's going on. So thank you so much again. Before we conclude on the advanced section, I think there's still lots more to talk about. So what else would you say that people should be thinking about when we're taking a big picture view on this kind of regulation?
Yeah, again, so with this now coming into the regulatory remit of the FCA, we spoke about this earlier, but it means that these lenders need to make sure that there's access to the financial ombudsman. Individuals will now have access to the financial ombudsman. So this means that there may be an increase in complaints to Klarna and various other variations. So legal teams need to be advising these lenders on what the process is, how are they going to handle these complaints, what's that going to look like, what are they doing already, and how do they ensure that their complaints is in compliance with what the FCA require such lenders to offer to their consumers. It wouldn't be a commercial topic without talking about AI. We may have sort of financial technology, regulatory technology that kind of comes up over the next couple of months into the next year that can kind of be used within the space. I don't know what that looks like, but it may assist, that maybe something that these platforms develop, and then again understanding that and seeing how it fits in with what the clients are doing, but again ensuring compliance with the FCA. There's a whole host of things. There could be changes in the amount of employees that are needed, because actually we don't need all of these people doing this because this now sits over here. So we may have the employment teams involved. And I think there are going to be a whole host of changes. And I think there's going to be a real shift in how these buy now, pay later schemes operate as a result of these, or the FCA taking it into its regulatory remit. Because I think at the moment it is operating pretty much like the Wild West. So being able to kind of now have this captured by the FCA not only protects consumers, but it also brings some level of standardization to what's being offered. So lawyers and future lawyers that are interested in this space, it's really something, that is something to follow. And I remember when I was in-house, one of the things, so I went in-house doing sort of the stuff that I usually do, and contracts and stuff, but what became quite a big part of my role was FCA authorization, because the organization I worked for offered products that were able to be purchased on finance. Not something I'd ever kind of knew much about, save for the LPC. So it's something that really impacts a lot of clients in a lot of different ways. So having a broad level of knowledge and understanding and really following the story, I think when you come into your training contract, will really set you up in good standing, because the FCA sort of rule book and sort of the prohibitions, the how to get authorized, what you can and cannot do, the regulated activities order, and all of that stuff is a minefield for the most part. So following a story like this kind of puts a lot of that theory into kind of a practical scenario that can really help you kind of understand it.
Thanks so much. I think that's a really perfect tip as well, because I think a lot of people looking to get into commercial law, they find some of these more technical elements quite daunting, because it is hard to understand in theory, but when you're looking at it in practice, in a real story, it kind of makes it make sense. So I think that is a really good tip for developing commercial awareness, but also just, your understanding of the different things going on in these industries. So thank you so much for that. And was there anything you wanted to add on the advanced level before we conclude?
No, I think we've covered quite a lot in that one.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we did as well. And I think that is a perfect note to end on, of just that this is the kind of story that, if you follow it, will help you grasp some of these things that they might seem too technical or hard to understand from the outset. So thank you again, Henry, for all of your insights. And then thank you to our audience for joining today's Commercial Awareness Compass. Remember, commercial awareness is more than just staying on top of the news. It's about understanding why these events matter to clients and how you, as a future lawyer, can provide that strategic value. So as Henry and I were talking about today, it really is about being an active reader of the news rather than passive, and really think about these stories and follow them along. So join us next week to keep building your commercial awareness. And until then, prepare without the panic.